We are going to start this 8th edition of the International Course on Human Rights. Dear participants, good mornings, good afternoon, good evening, depending on the time zone from where you're watching us. My name is Cynthia Belbusi, and we would like to welcome you all to our course, Humanities for Sales, Human Trafficking in Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean. We would like to remind you that we have simultaneous interpretation services. Participants could access the channel of your language of choice. We wish the speakers to speak slowly so that the translation can be made. We would like to inform you that in order to guarantee accessibility to this human rights course, we also provide a service of sign language. During the interpretations, the interpreters will be speaking with the speakers, and therefore all the participants can have access to the content. As enlightened by the title, we want to talk about a complex issue that has to do with the sale of human beings, a historic and present practice whose human and political nature comprises different aspects. We would like to talk about the different aspects and scopes and the challenges to fight against it, to protect the victims and survivors, and to eradicate the violation of fundamental rights. This would be our aim throughout these meetings. That's why we have called upon different experts that, in addition to providing their reflections, are interested in exchanging opinions with the other speakers, continuing with the production of knowledge of those that value all these topics. In order to pass this course, you would have to fulfill with two instances, to fulfill with 75% of attendance in synchronic classes and pass a multiple choice test at the end of the course. You will have to obtain the form in the exam section and fill it in online. Those that are not interested in that certificate could be granted the certificate of attendance. Now I would like to introduce those that are responsible for this course. First, we would like to welcome Master Fernanda Gil Lozano, who is Executive Director of the International Center for the Promotion of Human Rights under the auspices of UNESCO. Fernanda, you have the floor. Thank you, Cynthia. First, I would like to welcome you all to this 8th edition of the International Course on Human Rights, organized by the International Center for the Promotion of Human Rights under the auspices of UNESCO. Since 1994, the program, The Roads of Enslaved People, Resistance, Freedom, and Heritage of UNESCO, has fostered the knowledge and reflection, critical reflection upon slavery, a tragedy, a crime that has blighted and continues affecting our social and cultural and economic structures. The aim of the team that has organized the core has been to render visibility to the historical effects of slavery, addressing its current repercussions and the challenges to human rights towards the eradication of human trafficking. The opening conference will review the race discourses that had justified slavery, giving light to the relationship between these ideologies and the structural inequalities that regretfully are still prevalent today. Transatlantic trafficking, one of the longest and most severe in history, has forced the displacement of between 12 and 15 million African people to America between the 16th and 19th centuries. It is estimated that almost 15% died in transit. This phenomenon has allowed for the accumulation of wealth of the economies of the colonies and has created foundations for the race-based structures and economic structures that prevail today. These facts would let us analyze how the colonial history has affected and affects opportunities and livelihood and living conditions of several communities. Every block or session would address a specific aspect to human trafficking. The assessment of the causes for this phenomenon will take into account how gender, race, and class make up part of the exploitation and how these aspects continue being intertwined in the present. Girls and women account for 71% of the victims of trafficking at a global level. And economically disfavored persons are the most vulnerable and affected, especially in countries with high inequality in terms of income and very few protection resources. This panel would let us explore how the gender-based norms and the race-based dynamics act as the foundation for vulnerability. The following topic will be focused on international enforcement or regulatory frameworks. The Palermo Protocol, an instrument adopted in the year 2000 and ratified by 178 countries, set forth a definition and the fundamentals to combat human trafficking. However, according to the UN Offices Against Drug and Crime, only 10% of the victims of human trafficking that have been identified in the world have received some sort of protection and assistance. In this block, we will look into the scopes and limits of the legislation and the barriers to its effective enforcement and implementation that help us analyze the challenges to the protection of rights. As regards sexual exploitation, the course will dig deeper into the slavery that affects girls and women. It is estimated that about 70% of the victims of human trafficking with a view to sexual exploitation are women and girls, and that this percentage is even higher in contexts of forced mobility or humanitarian crisis. This section will analyze how gender and race, combined in this context, contour frameworks, are the base for a systematic violence that jeopardize fundamental rights. We will also discuss the impact of technology and globalized criminal rings or networks that amplify exploitation. The analysis of the trafficking of girls, boys, and adolescents as another serious way of exploitation will include data about the multiple formats that they use. According to the UN Fund for Childhood, 28% of the victims identify victims of trafficking are girls and boys. In regions like Sub-Saharan Africa, Central America, and the Caribbean, they account for a higher ratio of the victims of the identified suffering this crime, 63%. Most of them are subjected to forced labor, sexual exploitation, and recruitment for armed conflicts. These practices that affect minors and adolescents during their physical and psychological development represent a major violation to human rights and call for effective protection policies. In the case of trafficking for labor exploitation, we will look into the different contexts of forced labor and the sectors where these increasingly prevails. The ILO estimates that about 16 million persons in the world are being subjected to forced labor in different sectors, from agriculture to textile industry, with income that are devoted directly to human trafficking networks. This crime requires an articulation between protection of protection policies from civil society and strategies to include the voices of the survivors in the design of the different replies. The panel about companies and human rights will address the role that the private sector plays and the importance of due diligence. That is a key principle for the prevention of exploitation in supply chains. At a global level, less than 50% of the companies have effective policies against trafficking in their supply chains. The lack of strict controls increases the risks for business activities to contribute to exploitation practices. Finally, the course will close with a module about the accountability of states and the support to victims and access to justice. In the international arena, less than one out of every three victims of human trafficking has access to justice or is receives some sort of reparation. This session will discuss a different assistance measures and the obstacles that should be overcome in the reparation process, highlighting the representative cases and experiences of survivors that have been cornerstone to make the vulnerable rights visible and the need to strengthen the protection by states. I encourage you to start using the analytics tools available and the theoretical knowledge that will be delivered throughout the course and that would allow you to fully understand the effects, the historical effects, and the contemporary effects of human trafficking. Likewise, I would like to encourage you to think of the facts and global trends, analyzing as countering this crime, all these facts to contribute to the promotion of human rights. Thank you very much for joining us and for joining this space of learning.
Y tendencias globales, analizando en la lucha contra este delito para contribuir a la promoción de los derechos humanos. Muchísimas gracias por sumarse a este espacio de aprendizaje.
Giselle, you have the floor.
Muchísimas gracias, Fernanda, por tus palabras.
Good morning, good afternoon.
Paso ahora el piso a Giselle Urbano, directora de Ciencias Sociales y Humanas y punto focal de género para Centroamérica y Colombia, de la Organización de las Naciones Unidas para la Educación, la Ciencia y la Cultura. La escuchamos,
in the
Giselle.
face of a reality that regretfully is still very prevalent and needs to
Muy
be
buenos
urgently
días,
treated from
buenas
different
tardes
aspects
para todos y todas que el día de hoy
that would
tienen
allow
el
us to
privilegio de poder asistir
work.
a este curso
It is a pleasure
que
to
pretende
represent UNESCO
poner
today.
en
And as I've
a
said
todas y a
before,
todos en contexto
during another
frente a una realidad que
meeting
lastimosamente
that we have
sigue
shared
siendo
with
muy
the International
presente y
Center
que
for the
urge
Promotion
ser
of Human
tratada
Rights,
desde los
we
diferentes
need to
ángulos
speak up and to
y
speak
aristas que nos sea
for
posible
the
trabajar y actuar.
sake of human rights, to put
Un gran gusto
human
estar
rights
aquí
at the
representando
heart
a
of
la
everything.
UNESCO el día de hoy y como lo
Today,
decía ya en
the
otra
attendees
ocasión
have
que
the
compartimos
privilege
con el Centro Internacional de Promoción para los Derechos Humanos,
listening to
debemos poner
speeches and
y con la voz más
conferences
alta
at the
posible
highest
los
level.
derechos humanos en
And
el
at
centro de la
UNESCO,
discusión,
we
en
use
el
all this
centro
to put
de la
into practice
atención a
and
todos los
to
niveles. El
fulfill
día de
with
hoy,
our
como
mandate
decía
of
yo
science,
anteriormente,
culture,
los y las
information, and
presentes tienen el
education.
privilegio de asistir
This year we
a
celebrate the 30th
ponencias,
anniversary
seminarios del
of the
más alto nivel
scientific
académico
program
que les dará el human trafficking, a form of slavery, a modern form of slavery, which involves multiple actions and forms of exploitation. We are going to discuss a complex issue, a complex problem for several reasons. First and foremost, because it's deceitful in appearance, meaning some of the forms of exploitation that are involved in human trafficking are highly visible, but they hide the slavery chains underpinning them. So, on certain occasions, it's difficult to detect at a social level human trafficking events or situations when indeed they are before our eyes. A second aspect that adds additional complexity to this issue is that human trafficking appeals to an imagery that is sometimes deceitful as well, especially when it comes to thinking of or assuming what the potential victims are, whom they're considered a part of a more vulnerable sector, undoubtedly, but which is not necessarily limited to that area. Women in poverty, women who are undergoing a more vulnerable situation, so that on certain occasions we lose sight of others that are a part of the potential sectors or the sectors that may be victims of human trafficking. It is also complex for a third reason, namely that it involves several degrees of acceptance by power sectors. So facing it, putting an end to its scope, eradicating and putting an end to it is also a significant hurdle in this situation. A fourth reason that allows us to discuss the complexity of the issue facing us is the extent to which it extends at a global political level. Along the course, we will try to look into these complexities, to think about them, reflect upon them, shed some insight into them, and understand the dimensions and different aspects of human trafficking. We will have a number of experts from different fields of expertise, intellectuals, people from the academia, legal experts. That is, people who are very well prepared and specialized in this field of topic, who will enlighten us and suggest different approaches to what we have to think about when it comes to analyzing the meaning and implications, as well as the scope of human trafficking and the possibility of indeed not only redressing victims for their suffering, those who have survived these practices, but also the possibility of putting an end to these practices which are in breach of human rights. So I hope we have a very good course, and I wish you every success. Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Andrea, for your words. Now it is now the turn to give the floor to Marisa Pinot, academic coordinator as well. Marisa, you have the floor. Thanks, Cynthia. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to those who have joined us and who have decided to take up this course. We are very happy to reach this point, this 8th course. I won't go into details because those who took the floor before me have clearly explained what the scope of this proposal is. We try to raise awareness and put under the limelight the discussion on the history and consequences of human trafficking throughout history and at the present time. I hope that this course will be fruitful for those who are participating in order to raise greater awareness and also have something to do in this affair and realize how human trafficking involves us all. Sometimes it is made invisible because of the long lasting history present in our countries regarding enslaved people's trafficking and slave trafficking in the past. I will try to go to the point, not that much because much has been said already, and we have a long morning ahead of us with plenty of speakers and the most interesting morning. But let me remind you that today we will start with a conference by Dr. Rina Cáceres on the consequences of human trafficking in history, and then a round table on the topic. We will then continue discussing on the subsequent days, starting at 9 in the morning with 2 consecutive round tables. We are going to start at 9 a.m. in the morning Argentina time and finish at 1 p.m. Argentina time. On Friday, lastly, we are going to have a longer round table with the participation of human trafficking victims and survivors. It's going to start at 9 in the morning Argentina time and end at 11 a.m. Then we will have a joint discussion on the challenges lying ahead, and we will close with a presentation of a publication bringing together papers of the Third Regional Forum Against Modern Slavery. This regional forum dealt with modern slavery in Latin America, and it will be an excellent closing for this course, I believe. So with that, I welcome you all. I wish you all the very best, every success for this course. And first and foremost, I hope that we will have some effective involvement based on what we learn, what we discuss along this course when we go home and engage in our day-to-day activities and actions. Thanks very much, Marisa, for your words. Now, as you said, we are going to move on to the opening keynote lecture, The Roads of Enslaved People. We will talk about the deconstruction of the race-based concept, which justified human trafficking, and also the questioning of social, cultural, and economic inequalities resulting from this fateful history. Since its launching in 1994, the UNESCO program, The Roads of Enslaved People, Resistance, Freedom, and Heritage, has aimed to carry out actions to bring to light the history of slavery and to bring this tragedy, which lies at the foundation of the contemporary world, to the memory of all human beings. This conference will contribute to the purpose of this UNESCO program. We have the valued presence of Dr. Rina Cáceres, Emeritus Professor at the History School, Costa Rica University, also researcher of the Africa and Caribbean Studies faculty. She's also a member of the International Scientific Committee of the UNESCO program, The Roads of the Slave Resistance, Freedom, and Heritage. You can read the rest of her bio on the platform. Dr. Cáceres, you have the floor, and you have 40 minutes for your presentation. Thanks very much. I was going to share a PowerPoint slideshow. I don't know if I can share my screen. Let me tell you that there is a storm going on here, and my first attempt was to read it, but I decided to prepare a PowerPoint just in case you could not hear me correctly, just in case climate change goes against us. We see your screen now. Can you see it? Yes, absolutely well. Thanks very much to the organizers of the International Center for the Promotion of Human Rights and to the National Coordinating Committee of this course, whom I know I see also some familiar faces. And I am profoundly thankful for the invitation, which constitutes a challenge. Billiards, soccer teams, beauty contests, and in public wages, the palette that many young people get inspiration from to materialize their dreams. This is Gabby Douglas, an Olympic medalist in the period 2012-16. She has won several Olympic medals and she's going to compete again. She says that when she was a child in Virginia, she was also uh, bullied and she was called the slave. They always asked racist questions and they set her apart from the group. They made her feel isolated from the group. I will repeat this concept. This made her cry and she felt like quitting her favorite sport. The family moved to another state. She made it to the Olympics, but the bullying did not end there. This last decade, she has faced bullying because of her hair. This is Gabby. She's a young woman today, but since she was a kid, she was called a slave. You are the slave. You are the one who has no rights. So this leads me to think of why the word slave appears even today, not only at this level, but also in soccer and football teams, and not only at the league level. It appears in schoolyards during Sunday matches. So, what does the word slavery means? My comments today, therefore, will focus on four aspects: what slavery means, America's population and the legitimization of African slavery, social mobility, and the idea of who belongs to the nation. Why this idea of excluding some over others? So, as you know, and very well noted at the beginning of this course, slavery is a global scourge. It's not inherent to Africa alone, as it is usually believed. It is a legal condition. Not all African descendants have been enslaved. Many young people who migrate from Africa to Europe are faced with this narrative. Young people from Kenya, Tanzania, who have joined university and whom I have talked to, they always say that the first reference that people have of them is you were a slave. And they represent this is not part of their history at a national, local level. So, what do I mean? That not all African descendants were enslaved. And today, as very well noted as well, throughout the world, according to the ILO, for example, there are over 50 million people who have been enslaved throughout the world from different nationalities in all 5 continents. So I want to start with the basics, maybe 2 basics for you, the students who have joined us for this course. The definition of slavery, it varies from one society to another, from place to place, and also of the legal system enforced in that location. It's a social relationship, a specific form of exploitation, of human exploitation, where
subjects are faced with a duality. There's a constant tension between the one being enslaved and the one enslaving, each trying to expand the limits or boundaries of the relationship. Enslaved people are people within the framework of Atlantic human trafficking, but they are considered goods, and as such they are considered something to belong to somebody else or property. It's the only construct in human history where this takes place. There is a traditional definition of slave, which has lasted throughout time and refers to this concept, slave, male or female slave. I would like to refer to Claude Meillassoux here, who used to say that the term slave, male or female slave, emphasizes the person's nature as an item of good on an equal footing as cattle and things that is being subdued to an owner. It prioritizes or privileges the institutional vertical relationship, master-slave, and serves to legitimize the owner's authority over the person being enslaved. And by hiding or preventing the social relation in our imagery, there is no idea about the anti-slavery struggles, the fights for freedom that were started in the American continent. Generally, when we learn about freedom, we do so within the framework of the French Revolution, and we forget to mention the 200, 300 years of struggles undertaken by the people who were enslaved in the Americas. For Claude Meillassoux, this is an ideological fiction when assimilating human beings to an object or even an animal. He says that this is a fiction that we believe of today because it was not so in practice. If in practice people had been treated as such, slavery would not have any superiority over the use of material instruments, but that's what the one committing slavery incurs in. People subject to slavery would not have any responsibility as Homo sapiens or the acknowledgement by owners of their ability to discern the job of managing, building, looking after children, cooking, growing, trading, diving, etc. As I said, slavery is a social relationship, is the most extreme forms of domination where the maximum power rests with the owner, and there is a complete absence of power by the person being enslaved. Now then, how was slavery legitimized and how was violence legitimized in societies like ours where people were enslaved, as it was the case throughout Latin America, including the Caribbean? Throughout this territory, slavery was part of their everyday lives. A legal system was put in place, a set of regulations which legitimized owners' total power. I have been publicly been told that, well, but this was only natural, but no, this is not intrinsic to the African peoples. It is intrinsic to a legal system which legitimized and normalized this, attributing full ownership to the owner and justifying ownership of certain individuals over others. And it was presented as the natural order of things. This is what things are like, hiding the fact that the laws were actually written by certain peoples. Even more serious, it justified the hereditary condition, the hereditary nature of this condition through the lei partus sequitur ventrem. It is a piece of legislation that has been researched into in Argentina, Chile, and other countries. It was a law that was in force for 300 years, and it was cross-cutting amongst all Spanish legislation in the Americas. The son of an enslaved mother was a slave as well, resting or placing ideological responsibility in the imagery that women conveyed slavery. to their children. And therefore, we find a large number of relations, marriage relations, where many men prefer or tend to join free peoples whose children may have the possibility of being free. Enslaved women were submitted to this violent law, that is, of their children being enslaved, of their sexuality and their work being appropriated by the owners. These ideas, these laws that circulated encouraged this idea that African and Africans were barbarians, uncivilized, and which called for slavery in order to convert them into Christianism and redeem them. This idea was present, this was present until mid-20th century, and much of this legacy is seen today.
I want to speak about the demographic weight of women. In a study that was conducted, it shows that out of all the persons that came during colonial times, 87% were African women. Out of those that arrived here, we are not talking about biological reproduction, but people that arrived during colonial times, and 13% were European women. This means that the weight or the burden of demographic reproduction was on the shoulders of women, and that would explain our high level of Afro-descendants and Afro-mestizo that was somehow hidden under the word mestizo, that is more neutral. But this shows an example of our Latin American families. Enslaved persons were considered foreigners, and it's very important to highlight this. Though they were descendants of African Spaniards and they had lived and were born for many generations in the region, the idea of being external to the group of a different phenotype of origin and legal condition was maintained for 300 years, and their legacies, the way of prevails today. I mean, it's external for origin and phenotype. Enslaved persons were aware that their situation could be changed and towards a higher punishment, like the death on the sale of or trade on a family member within that system. And I'm talking about a system, it's not isolated facts, but a system that cut across every colonial movement. Physical violence and symbolic violence and cohesion was at the heart of the conformation of our societies. However, this violence and these laws and these regulations did not prevent the reconstruction of identity networks, a permanent exercise of recovering their histories through syncretism and the creation of new linguistic and religion movements. Let's move on to the second idea, the population of America. Africa was the largest provider of labor force for the Americas. More than 12 million persons were taken from the African continent through merchant companies of mixed capitals, shareholders, based corporations formed in Europe. This is what has led to this research in the London College, that by studying the actions of those involved in these companies, it is possible to see the scope or the extension of the participation of people from different places and their involvement in the trade on slaveries. It was a very well-organized activity. This map shows the intense movements, these arrows. I will leave you with the PowerPoints because these arrows that show the different routes. I would like to point out that there was another preconceived idea that people coming from all the African continent came to America, but in fact, it's mainly Mozambique and all the areas along the coastline. Those were the areas that bore a cultural influence on the identity of Latin America. Africa was not an empty continent. It had its own history. If we look at the long coast on the Atlantic Ocean from Senegal to South Africa, they are organized societies, organized as states or as communities. All the regions, and this is a single example of the connection present between Africa and the commercial networks connected to the Mediterranean and to Europe and Africa. But from the east of Africa, there was connection with China, India, and Iran. So this image helps me explain that these connections that would transport basic products for livestock, textiles, towards gold also, salt and gold and copper, towards the Mediterranean, from where they imported paper, tools, and clothes. That also implied a connection with Spain. When we talk about Spain and the conquest of America, let's not forget about a Spain that was isolated. Spain is hand in hand, well connected with Africa. That's why there were connections between Granada and sub-Saharan Africa. When we talk about the Cresques Atlas, we see very clearly in this map the location of Mali and the knowledge and cartography that it was not an empty space or a barbarian or wild or populated by savages, but rather there was an important connection between Granada and Timbuktu. Sankore, there was the first university based there. The arrow is a little bit wrongly located, should be placed to the left, but there was a connection between the university and Granada and Timbuktu. That was a UNESCO project and a research project of the University of Granada to the connection with Timbuktu since the 14th century. I wanted to show you that this was not an empty or continent or a barbarian continent, but something happened in the world in the 16th century, that major structural change. I'm a professor, and when we lecture, and most of us have been students, and we also learned that the Industrial Revolution was sort of a turning point in society. Of course, it was a turning point, but the 16th century was a major turning point for the Americas. But in fact, it was a time of pandemics. There were several pandemics, so we have just suffered one. There was a context of wars and ecologic problems as well, and there are colleagues from Mexico who are working on the impact of the environment, to put it somehow, in the political situation. And as you well know, there was a decrease of local indigenous populations. These pandemics, these wars, these environmental problems led to a decrease, a slump in the number of indigenous. They did not disappear except for the Caribbean islands, where in 50 years all of the population came to an end. Died. Most of the people died, and there some remains. This implied a reconfiguration of the agricultural structures because there was not enough labor force and there was not enough food. We were in the middle of this crisis when Europe learned about this, and the monarchies and private companies that are dedicated to raw material extraction learned about this. And we know what the history is like. The first dwellers arrived through the military conquest, and they followed the drive of the Spanish conquest from the north to the south, and is a spirit of conquest, that spirit of success reaches out to our lands. They settle, and there's a serious labor problem. At the beginning, they enslaved the indigenous. Up until in 1542, the slavery of indigenous people was banned. They attempted in North America, specifically in Virginia, to take European labor force that is not enslaved, but through the granting of lands. And that gave way to an important movement of persons from Great Britain to Virginia. And for the first 13 colonies, for the early colonies, many impoverished individuals came from Great Britain to these lands, and the main aim they had in mind was to get land. Then they realized that that negotiation does not work, that the British Crown opposes, and therefore exchanging land for labor does not work. And they started to develop this connection with the north of Africa, and they started developing the idea of moving persons from Africa to America. And this dramatic trade starts, and as you can see on this map, the Atlantic Ocean becomes the bridge that communicates Africa and the Americas. The Atlantic Ocean is the space of sailing and the space that they will use to transfer people. If you want to look at figures, you can see the database about enslaving trips that has very strict information about how people were taken from one place to the other, who they were, how many there were. They were not only individuals, but also products, goods to Africa and to Europe. It was an exchange or a trade and favorable both for the Americas in financial terms and human terms as well. When we look at the database about the slavery trips, and we see data about the movement of or displacement of individuals, we see that everything finishes on the Atlantic coastlines of the Americas. However, this was not so. They arrived at these coastal points or coastal cities, and then they continued traveling internally. We would have to continue placing arrows about the trafficking from Mexico to Argentina. There's a large number of routes that were used to take individuals from one place to the other. There were monopolistic contracts between the Spanish Crown and a private company that subcontracted other companies to use their vessels, and secondly, local authorities to become their representatives. Therefore, they were all involved. The trips of the most powerful companies were done from one point in Africa and several points in the Americas, like Barbados, Jamaica, Havana, Veracruz, Cartagena, Portobelo, Bahia, Buenos Aires. Persons that had been kidnapped from coastline communities in Africa were taken along these routes from Senegal to Sierra Leone or Guinea-Bissau, which is today Ghana, Nigeria, and further south, Angola or Mozambique. And they were taken to a port in the Caribbean either in North and South America. Once they got there in America, they started a different trip, and that is something that we care about a lot. The merchants that participate in these other trips had less economic capacity. I mean, they belong to different they had different nationalities, and they traded on prohibited goods, and they traded on persons and used vessels beyond their capacity. These are people that are not found on the maps. In the 21st century, we don't have those arrows that allow us to see the internal distribution. Because in this second and third stage, survivors were sick, and they suffered from hunger, and they were affected by different diseases. The Middle Passage talks about the Atlantic trip that finishes in a point in America, but our trip continued towards a third, fourth, and fifth stage. At the end, in a market, on a square, they were sold, and in that town there was a preacher or someone that would walk the streets shouting that there was a sale of black persons. I mean, he was saying there was an auction of slaves, and they got here, and there were 3 days of auctions, and the third day they would sell them. The people that had been kidnapped after those long trips, they would get to a place where they would be auctioned. And at that time, the person that had been kidnapped in African lands becomes a slave under the control of the local authorities and the engagement and active participation of the dwellers and neighbors. There was no city or no space in the colonies of America where the presence of, quote unquote, black persons that were for sale was not a fact. In the indigenous communities, there were few possibilities because that happened within the Spanish framework. I mean, the Spanish administrations did not have complete control over the territory. In those spaces, those communities that were under control under the control of the Spanish and the French authorities, then slavery of black persons was something regular or something habitual. In the indigenous communities that were outside these communities, this was not a fact. However, those indigenous communities that were closer to the Spanish communities, because they had to pay taxes, they had to move towards the Spanish communities, they were also affected by these ideologies or influenced by these ideologies. I would like to talk about this preconception stating that every African was enslaved. During the colonial times, they were Afro-descendants or considered black persons or mestizos that were not part of these groups of black persons that were freed, or released. Many populations of the Central American Pacific Ocean many communities were founded by these free people. I mean, they created these pueblas of these groups of peoples. The authorities would receive their taxes, and they would have labor force that would be part of the military as well. And there were other characters as well. Alejandro Dumas. Her grandmother was from Haiti. Joseph Boulon, who was a Frenchman, and his works, his pieces of art of music were very famous, and they were played in different contexts and places. And I would like to conclude by talking about the legacy and who belongs to these nations. We know that the abolishment of slavery took like 100 years after the Haitian Revolution, and the last one was Brazil. There was a long period in which slavery was abolished. And I would now talk about the post-independence and narrative. The slavery was abolished and the Republican states were being formed, that they laid a foundation of our present. We need to remember that those nation states or those republics did not came of a vacuum, but they were part of an international and local framework. Something very important, or one of them, was created during the formal occupation of Asia and Africa. Asia during the Berlin Conference that lasted from 1885 to 1960, approximately. It is a time in which these ideas of civilization and barbarism justified imperial policies that were replicated at a local level. They bore an impact at a local level. And the narrative starts changing because any reference to Asia and Africa would make us appear as more barbarian and less civilized. We have the laws for racial segregation in the US that were disseminated through the exporting community companies or through the military ideas. These ideas were cascading down to the South. Then in the South, the ideas to improve Latin American blood that was very common in America, that was weakened by the combination of African and indigenous blood. Then there is promotion of European migration, and then the European dissemination, European context dissemination was born in that area. In those years, colonies stopped promoting the census because people believed that they were nowhere. There was no longer diversity in our societies, creating the image or idea of white societies. And these ideas were reflected upon in the education systems, where the race-based ideas became part of the public policies. And this is the main challenge. How would we revert all this? Well, I propose changing the text with which our young people are educating and the ones that we read as adults. These texts that made their primary school partners to call Gabi that she was a slave, those texts that are used to teach children that make them shout that another kid is a slave. What do texts say? At the time of sitting for the exams to pass from primary school to secondary school, the children need to know the first cities that were formed during the colony. Although they were ephemeral populations, they have a name. Ephemeral towns, they have a name to remember. The way in which these names are pronounced, and not the names of indigenous communities, not the names of the Afro-descendant communities that were formed during colonial times. The mentioning the names imposed by the administrative Spanish apparatus legitimizes the oppression place. I mean, and it creates the image that they were created in an empty land, and that grants more power to this legitimacy creating towns, parishes, creates in the narrative the fact that this is the beginning of the times. We have inherited these times, these historical times with the names of the cities that were founded. Within that framework, in the books, they reinforce the concept of civilization and modernity, and with clashing the concepts of averaging and primitive. There's always an antonym in the explanation, and the explanation is that someone is primitive and someone is the averaging. And the so-called white summarize the idea of education and civilization. They have done barbarian things. They are characters that have a name. They build these. The narrative chooses who dominates. This is not natural. Someone has written that book, that text, and the person writing chose those heroes, those figures, those names to define the ethos, the groups. And the others, they were alien to the group. They did not belong to the group. Gabi used to say, I don't feel part of the group. Why I don't feel part? That was said by a young person who wanted to participate as a Miss Costa Rica. Why they tell me that my hair is bad? I am from here. Why do they say that I don't belong? Being outside a group is related to origins, geographies, and phenotypes. The spaces and geographies of the indigenous peoples are limited to their towns or localities, unlike the European ones. They're more magnificent, they are larger, without any reference to inequalities in the European continent. And from Africa, we always have some tribal image. What other elements influence in our way of thought? Well, this is the most typical image of the Americas, not only of Latin America, but America and Europe, the way in which colonial history starts with this chart that might have different explanations within its context, but without a context. When you see these images, you see persons that are subjected, chained, without a possibility of breaking those chains and without social mobility. I found these in Canada, from Canada to South America. It is incredible how they use this model in different formats, but they are about the same. And there are some other contexts, and is the fact that they use cartoons. I mean, in the U.S. there was the U.S. had a great influence in Latin American and through agriculture and exporting companies and the military presence. But it was also an ideology. The ideology cascaded down, and we need to know how much of that ideology has permeated, and we find it in the newspapers of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. One thing is the use of the cartoons and how they are drawn and how they appear to resemble animals. This blackface was a raw material in all Latin America and in all of the Americas and in Europe and the world about making a joke with their body. In the US, and I assume that not in many places of the world, lynching someone was considered a public party, though it was not a social practice in Latin America, as far as I know. We find this piece of news. I mean, it appears in the media, and it is there in the written press without being questioned. They were the times of human zoos. And that is why last year there was a girl doing a birthday party and the readers started posting these pictures.
This is a heartbreaking image. It's a girl receiving food at a universal fair. These universal fairs and trade shows showed the greatness of colonization, and also on the right an image of Africa and the one on the center too, but this last one is from Germany. That was how people's characters were portrayed in 19th century media. There's the flag face also in children's stories, fables, made them universal. Caricaturization or cartooning of the body has implications. It creates stereotypes, and it is intended to devaluing young people's bodies, their emotional security and self-perception, and their self-esteem. She almost quit. Being born, working and living in the country appears not to be sufficient to be part of the group that constitutes society. Does it mean that being African descendant, Black or indigenous will not be enough? Will they ever have the physical features, or will they need to mimic the other community? Will this be the true price for their citizenship? Stories, historical discourse that have been studied, learned, and repeated by hundreds of students in the region. Certain images contribute to developing a given thought structure. And in that definition of thought, who belongs and who does not, there's no importance being paid to the use of violence, epistemological violence that is built and developed every day in classrooms and which is expressed in public spaces, from football playgrounds to political context. They learn to be excluded, but it is also taught to be actively excluding. People are taught to look down on others, and that patronizing look of those who were taught to believe they own certain privileges. Racism means violence, threat, and intimidation of millions of people, and it takes place in classrooms, classroom breaks, football playgrounds, schoolyards, not just the Eurocopa. The vacuum of information was the proper broth for prejudice and discrimination to growth. And this evidence is the urgence of implementing a change or a shift in methodological paradigms regarding explanations given in the past. Access to equal conditions and the right to citizenship is accompanied by the right and the validity of the African descendant and the indigenous history in nations' ethos, and of course the decolonization of Africans and the descendants' image. Thanks very much. Well, Rina, thanks very much. Thanks very much for your interesting conference. You leave us longing for more. We are going to have a break until 11:15, and then we're going to move on to our panel where we are going to review issues related to history, which you have just introduced. So we give you a break until 11:15, and please do not leave the Zoom. We are going to use the same link. Thanks, Rina, Fernanda, Giselle, Andrea, and Marisa for having participated this morning. We resume in half an hour. Thanks. Thanks very much. Perfect. We could see it, the screen before, and now I see you. So I will start the session. Very well then. Dear participants, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. My name is Cynthia Balbusi. I will be moderating this panel of the International Human Rights course. Let me remind you that there is simultaneous interpretation available, and participants may choose the language channel of their choice. Please, we ask speakers to speak slowly to ensure that the interpretation flows smoothly. Also, let me tell you that to guarantee accessibility to this human rights course, we have the sign language interpretation services available throughout the course. Interpreters will be interpreting speakers' presentations to ensure all participants will have full access to the content being delivered. We'll hope that you have enjoyed the opening keynote conference, and those who have been unable to watch it, remember that lately you will find it taped on the platform to watch it asynchronously later. The next panel, called Past and Present Stories of the Different Forms of Slavery, will have Jean Bosco Cacosi, Monica Lima de Souza, and Marisa Pinot. We may say that because of its dimension and scope, the transatlantic trafficking of peoples had an indelible mark in history starting in the 16th century, extended for over 4 centuries. During that period, over 12 million peoples were enslaved and forcibly carried from Africa to the Americas and the Caribbean to work in plantations, mines, and in the Creole and foreign colonial homes. This panel wants to reflect upon the consequences of human trafficking in both continents and the importance of its memory today. We are going to give the floor to Dr. Cacosi, who has a master's in Latin American Studies from the Mexican Autonomous University and a member of Afro-Indo-Americas, a global anti-racism network, reporting to the Africanist Network for Latin America. Asociación Brasileira dos Estudios de África. You may read his full bio on the platform. Jean Bosco Cacosi, you have the floor. You have 30 minutes for your presentation. Thanks very much, Cynthia, and thanks, Marisa, and all of the organizers. I will first start sharing my slides because my presentation will be based on that. Can you see my screen? Very well, great. So I will talk about slavery in Africa and the destruction of political, economic, and social structures in Africa in the period comprised between the 16th and 19th century, and especially in the early 19th century before the abolition of slavery. And I will start with a preliminary note. Since I know there will be a panel on that, I will not go into details. Just let me tell you that there have been discussions which are still current on whether slavery existed in Africa or not, whether what happened in Africa might be called slavery or not. And I divide these thoughts into two subgroups. On the one hand, there is an anthropologist who works on racism, slavery in Brazil. His name is Kabengele Munanga. And he says that it is not possible about the slavery system in Africa, and he has some grounds for that. And then there's yet another group of people who say that it is possible to speak about slavery in Africa because the slave production approach did exist in that continent. Paul Lovejoy is a historian, an academic from Canada. Both are alive. And I understand that you are going to discuss this in greater depth as part of another panel. This allows me, therefore, to tell you more about what happened in Africa, what happened with slavery in Africa, and general ideas that I'm going to share with you are the following. Many of these ideas I have taken from a Senegal historian and linguist, Pate Diagne, who cooperated with volume 5 of the General History of Africa, published by UNESCO, the same organization that has gathered us here today. First, let me tell you that from the 16th century to the early 19th century, there was intense contact between Europeans, among Europeans, Africans, and Arabs. The Arabs started during the expansion of Islam in Africa. Back then, they started trading or engaging in the slave trade, as well as in the spice trade and trading with other products. Marisa Pino said that I have to deliver Swahili lessons. I speak Swahili today because in the east of Congo, my country of origin, slavery did get there, but it was the Arab slavery, the Indic slavery coming from India. And Arabs would come from Tanzania, Kenya to the Eastern African shores, and they entered the African continent all the way through East Congo. And they traded in spices, agricultural products, crops, silk, sugar, firearms, metals, and slaves, of course, or enslaved people. And also important to note is the participation of Arabs in trans-Saharan Mediterranean trade, as well as with the Indian shores above all. Before the arrival of the European traders and colonizers, first the Portuguese, then the French, Dutch, and English, they pursued different routes. One is not much studied, the transatlantic route, the trans-Saharan, Mediterranean, and Indic trade routes that were most studied. They were the ones used by the Arabs to trade or to convey and carry trade. But then as regards the Europeans, the first to come were the Portuguese, especially reaching the eastern coast first, then the west coast, then came the French, the Dutch, and the English, reaching the Indian and Atlantic coasts. The high demand for enslaved peoples in the Americas impacted in the scope of Black slaves trafficking. If in the past they traded in non-human products, when trafficking became important, there was an increase in demand, and this had a huge impact on the population. There were wars, even racial cleansing, in also struggles to find goods, quote unquote, that is, slaves that would then be brought to the Americas. The contact was established first on the shorelines, so the most affected populations were the coastal and island populations. Trafficking and slavery, both transatlantic, Atlantic, and Indian, went beyond the African coast, and these had a significant impact on coastal populations in the African continent. Now then, the structures arising at that time would be related to these factors. There were both internal factors and external forces. Internal factors include demographic changes. That's because many will be deported to the Americas. We are talking here about transatlantic slavery. But in the case of Arabs, many will be deported, especially many African peoples will be deported to Asia, and some even to Europe along the Mediterranean route. And also the environment will be impacted since there will be changes. There is a larger presence on the African coast than in the mainland or inland Africa. Wars took place, and there will be changes in agricultural practices, and in the inland area, people will shift to the coastal areas, and this will bring about environmental changes. These is what caused or what impacted the environment and the demography. And these forces were slave trade, Christianism, Islam, and mercantilistic capitalism. Christianism and Islam are two of the external forces that will impact spiritualism, that will impact new religions, as well as legislation. Where Islam first set foot, it is there where the Islamic code will be implemented, for example, in relation to land tenure. And likewise, in relation to Christianism, it will bring yet another vision of how to relate to land. In turn, capitalism will impact the search for products. Traded in the Americas and exported from the Americas. Christianism and Islam will bring new religions and a new philosophy to Africa, and they will somehow become political forces in those regions where both Christianism and Islam were implemented that people were unaware of until then. People had their own way of living, their own spirituality, their own social or political organization, who held power, who did not, who people had to report to or obey. But with the onset of Christianism and Islam, this will have an impact on the social organization and political organization as well, in addition to their spirituality. Now then, who were slaves or who were enslaved in Africa, or enslaved peoples in Africa? This historian and linguist I have just quoted says there were certain terms being used in Africa that were almost synonymous to slave or enslaved person. But maybe it did not mean exactly the same. As in our Western languages. Apologies. For example, this term here, Jonya, which he says comes from the Mande language, Jong or Hon, in Spanish means captive. Jam, Wolof, Makoba in Fulfilled, Bayi in Hausa. And this was a captive person that was linked to the lineage. This is what happened. This could be found in empires such as those prevailing in Ghana, Mali, Tagore, Kanem, Borno, Karen Chat, Ashanti, Yoruba, Mwene Mutapa. Mwene Mutapa is Mozambique today, that is further south. Still there was this idea, this practice of taking captives and taking them away with them and turning them into members of that lineage. And I mean, but both Western and Eastern slavery brought about changes. They are human beings who are deprived of their rights. They will just be an item of trade. And the Jonya concept was different. There was not this idea of a human being becoming property or an item for that was subject to trade, or the fact that they were deprived of their rights. This did not exist.
We need to remember that people enslaved that reached the Americas when we think of the authorizations granted by the Spanish monarchy for the traders of slaves, they were mentioned or they were described as pieces of ebony. I mean, we were carrying 150 pieces of ebony. I mean, so they were considered goods or merchandise, and this was an idea that did not exist in Africa. Another idea that I want to mention is la mana, that comes from the term serere, from a language of Senegal. This means the owner of the land or owner of the soil. I mean, it was a land occupation system for family, livelihood, or local consumption. I mean, this land could not be sold. You could not speculate on that piece of land or dispose of that land. That system did not include leasing or rental or the division of the land. I mean, you can sort of the land use, I mean, the sort of someone working on the land and the other one getting the benefits or the profit. However, taxes were paid because they were levied by the state and by the authorities. or by the bosses or the chiefs of the clans or tribes. Taxes were levied on the agricultural production or the cattle bringing up. Before the introduction of the feudal system, the land was used as means of livelihood, but not as property that was owned by someone, but it was held by an owner. A person could not be the property of anyone or could not be owned by anyone. Then during the Greek and Roman times, Christianity gave way to the knowledge of feudalism. That is to say, new ideas started to come about that were related to the ownership of the land, the production of the land, and the concept of feudalism that was conveyed by the Romans, that system of relationship with the land and the production or use of land, and the people that are making use of the land. This concept comes from the north of Africa, and it comes down, or it cascades down south, and with the advent of Christianism and the Greek and Roman civilizations, those ideas are conveyed or are instilled in Africa. The region of the Great Lakes, the African Great Lakes, where I belong, because my country is in the region of the Great Lakes in Africa, there was in place a system that is a sort of semi-feudal regime that governed the relationships between farmers and shepherds. That is to say, or that system, in that system, someone owned land and leased that land to another person for him to use it to grow crops. To grow crops or to raise cattle. Then these, for example, in the case of cattle, they would use that land for grazing the cattle. Those using that land would grant something to the landowner. Oftentimes, the owners were chiefs or kings, the landowners, and these would be found in Burundi, in Uganda, in some areas of the eastern part of Congo. This system was practiced and was in place. In the Emirates, not in Asia, but in some Emirates or princedoms in Western Africa and some caliphates like the Sokoto Caliphate, Islamic law was practiced, that jihad was effective, and that in that region, Islam became distributed quite in the early stages, and it made an impact on the way in which individuals interacted and also in the way in which they related to the land. In Central and Eastern Africa and the Guinea Gulf, we'll see the appearance of Christian chiefs or leaders in Munemotapa, in Mozambique, in Zimbabwe. We will find the influence of the Christian feudal monarchy. This was in the 16th and 17th century. All those ideas impacted or affected the political and social organization of those kingdoms or empires. Well, their effect in economic structures, well,
how we will see how these ideas affected the political and economic organization and the way in which the ownership of land. But more specifically, in terms of the economic structures, we'll see that handicrafts and the different unions and groups were not controlled by the state. So the groups of people manufacturing some handicraft were not controlled by the state. There were many productive activities that were not controlled by the state, like the paper making in Egypt and Sudan, the sugar cane production in Egypt and the north of Africa, the raffia cloth production in Congo. In different parts of Africa, they produce salt, copper, and exploit gold mines. All those industrial or productive activities are developed, and in the roots changed. In Africa, we had internal African trade routes. For example, they started in the Great Lakes area and moved all the way to Ethiopia or Egypt or to the south of Congo or Zambia up to the Monomotapa Empire that is located next to Zimbabwe and Mozambique today. Or from Congo or Angola towards Gabon, Nigeria, Cameroon. However, with the arrival of the Europeans and their factories, the ports and the coast become big storage warehouses to store goods and also human beings. And the routes changed. I mean, the routes did not head towards the east, but rather these routes looked westwards. I mean, the enslaved persons were taken from Mozambique, from the eastern coast, and they were heading down. They moved, they went up from South Africa to the ports that would take them to the Americas. With the expansion of the the Spanish conquest in Northern Africa, there were some cities that were overtaken and there were people kidnapped further in. I mean, there is an author that proved that the sort of conquest or reconquest continued in Africa, and many cities in the north of Africa became stagnant in terms of their economy in the 17th or 18th century. I mean, mostly they are affected by the incursions of pirates. Niger, Chad, the Nile River area, countries like Burkina Faso, Chad, and the Portuguese basically looted the coast. They looted more than what they acquired, and that's how the transatlantic trade of slaves take place. To conclude, as a consequence of all these, we will see the collapse of the rural sector, the lack of connection between the rural sector of the country and the cities, and the ports lose connections with the interior parts of Africa, and some routes of trade disappear. Then insecurity and poverty start to grow, and there is a change of the nature of African states. An African state that was organized based on non-African principles, but based on the principles and theories that came from abroad. Some local borders disappeared, and there are new states that appear, well established states. Small states disappeared, and that was a consequence of colonization. When they decided to colonize Africa in the 19th century, the end of the 19th century, many old borders had disappeared, and many hunters or agricultural producers or shepherds lost their structures and they were very easily colonized, and the states became centralized states with foreign structures. Many states resisted this situation up until the European invasion at the end of the 19th century. I would like to tell you that the enslaving movements changed the configuration of Africa forever, and many of the problems that we face in Africa today have to do with the change of the cultural, political, and economic structures of Africa, and they keep on affecting us up until today. Thank you for your attention. Thank you so much, Dr. Shamboko Kakosi, for your presentation, for your words. Now I would like to give the floor to Monica Lima de Souza. Monica is a professor of African history. She's a doctor of social history. She specializes in slavery, coercion, and institutions and public policies. You can read her bio, her full bio in the platform. Monica, you have the floor. You have 30 minutes for your presentation. You have the floor. Thank you so much. Just to begin, I would like to thank you for the invitation. I would like to thank you for having this opportunity of joining you today in this discussion and dialogue with so many people with important ideas and comments for our time today, because we are talking about long-lasting histories, that have prevailed for such a long time, but are directly connected to what we are living today in our contemporary world. Like Professor Kakosi, I have a presentation to make, a PowerPoint, and I would like to share with you. Let's see if I can share my presentation. Yes, I think you can see me and see the presentation. It's displayed as a presentation. That is what I was trying to do. This is the title I have given to my presentation to start thinking of the terms that give way to this kind of trade. That is the despicable trade. Despicable trade is a term that dates back to the 19th century, at the time in which the struggle against the Atlantic trafficking of African people that were enslaved were moved to the Americas. This struggle that was subject to different stages. It was a very long process involving many years, with the involvement of the enslaved Africans that had already been freed in the Americas, and also the Africans that were located in the African continent, that who from the very first time or the very early stages of slavery fought against that. Therefore, it is a long history blighted by the pain and suffering. This is a history of pain and suffering, a very sensitive history, a history of hardship. But it is also a history blighted and marked by countless ways of resistance, from the armed resistance, the uprising and the resistance, the confrontation, direct confrontation, to the resistance that was aimed at finding different ways of accessing freedom, reaching freedom through different means. Therefore, there have been many forms of resistance. And there's also a cultural resistance given by the affirmation of these people that were losing their nature as human beings as treated as goods or merchandise. However, they have never turned into goods. They have always affirmed their human nature, either through confrontation or either through finding ways of surviving and accessing freedom, or else being able to free their direct descendants. And all these mark the history of slavery and trafficking. It is a history of pain, of struggle, and of affirmation. There you can see the data on the maps. For sure, you're well aware of these maps. These are maps that come from the Slave Voyages platform. These maps help us remember how the length in time that this has occurred and so many human beings that were involved. How many people were taken from their homes, from their villages, from their cities, from their homes, and transported to the Americas. And from these foundations, they were able to build the social life in our continents. I would like to interrupt you for a minute. It would be better, if you don't mind, that you can continue in Portuguese so that it would make translation of sign language easier. Oh yeah, great, it's easier for me. Thank you so much. I'm very happy to speak my language with all of you. Therefore, we have a map. This map that shows us the volume and direction of the route of enslaved Africans, both men and women that were enslaved. This map gives us an idea of the volume, the demographic dimension, and the length in time of this activity that shook, changed the history of the world for a long time. Therefore, this history is a history that is related not only to Africa, to America, but also with the world, the whole world. This second map that has been developed on the basis of that database that is part of this slavevoyages.org platform shows us those figures that help us visualize the size, the dimension that show us the Atlantic trafficking and also the internal trafficking of Africans that were enslaved. This image helps us size how big this trade was. However, when we speak of this Atlantic trafficking of enslaved Africans, we are speaking of the Atlantic history. And the Atlantic Ocean conceptually is a historical space. It's not an obstacle between both continents, Africa and America, and also Europe. The Atlantic Ocean is not only a passage, it is a historical space that builds its own history. That is an idea that is not new in the field of historical fields of studies. And there is a great thinker from Senegal, Europhal, as one of the persons who gave way to this theory, together with Magüero, that is a historian from Argentina, from Cordoba, who was the coordinator of the master's course on Africa in Mexico, who positively devised this theory at the end of the 90s, beginning of the year 2000s, giving way to a discussion, a debate that resulted in other spaces, other debates, and other stakeholders or speakers. We can talk about the beginning of this Atlantic history, but this is not the objective of this discussion, but rather to think that the Atlantic Ocean, that is where all this stage took place, this maritime stage took place of the Atlantic trade of enslaved Africans, of all these people. This space had been treated until the beginning of the 19th century as an Ethiopian ocean. Alex Castro, a Brazilian historian, published an article or a paper that included some maps where the Atlantic Ocean to the south of the equator, the South Atlantic, was considered Ethiopian Atlantic Ocean because it made reference to the presence of Black persons that were brought from Africa, even Black persons in vessels that crossed the ocean. Therefore, it is an ocean, an Ethiopian ocean, that is an expression that is connected and makes reference to those Africans and Black persons. Then calling the South Atlantic Ocean an Ethiopian ocean has been better recognized from that time because of the strong Black presence in that ocean. Then we can state that the Atlantic trade on enslaved Africans somehow has created this Atlantic space, a space that is important to mention that does not only include coastal regions. We are talking about an Atlantic space that somehow pours into the inner part of the continent that is connected to the Atlantic space. Having set the parameters of time and space, I will continue with the history and the way in which those studies or those papers dealt with this topic. I will address some aspects because this field is quite huge. There are many papers, many books written about it that are all very important for the different fields of expertise and in order for us to fully understand the present. I will just develop a part. There has been much discussion and much debates. There have been founders in the field of demography, the ones that I'm quoting here, and there's a whole debate about the impact of the Atlantic trade on the African slaves, a debate that gave way to great discussion, important papers, and that will deal with everything that for some authors was related to knowing whether the Western European powers that were involved in human trafficking would be responsible or accountable for what happened in those areas of the continent with that trade. Therefore, the impact of Atlantic trafficking is a discussion that is related to the politics even today. And all these publication of all these authors feeds into that discussion on that political impact. Up to what extent that trafficking worsened or damaged the situation of the African continent, and how, for example, like in the famous paper stated that Europe developed Africa. There are many controversies, many discussions, there are many demographic studies to see how, up to what extent the African population decreased during that time, how agricultural farming production was affected. And another great issue of discussion is whether there was slavery or not in the African continent before the arrival of the Europeans and all their demands. During that transatlantic trafficking or not. Well, this is another one of the great discussions, and the thesis of Voyage is that trafficking was prevailed in the continent before the transformations, and therefore those trafficking were similar to the ones that would take place in the Americas. There are other authors that believe that in the African continent there were forms of slavery, and how those forms of slavery could be considered serfdom or other kinds of cohesion and forced labor that already prevailed in that area. We also see the direct impact, but also some other histories from other viewpoints. I have selected this book. It's not the only one, but it's pretty interesting, of an author from Senegal, Sylviane Diouf, who published this book. There are several authors that were worked in this book, and these authors speak of the different forms with which they struggled against trafficking in the African continent.
This helps us understand not only that, but also have access to stories that are present in the major debates taking place about the Atlantic traffic of enslaved Africans. This has to do with the struggle against trafficking and different forms of trafficking, things that appear to reveal themselves as strategies which some societies used to defend their members, whether in immigration processes, in acquiring weapons for defense purposes, many mechanisms whereby certain African societies fought against these slave trafficking. This has to do with a major political debate, because oftentimes, indeed, many people say that there was connivance by African chiefs, by African traders related to Atlantic trafficking of enslaved Africans. This book helps us realize there was connivance not only by some chiefs and sovereigns, there were multiple actions, and also there was connivance by the population that resisted and fought against slavery and the Atlantic traffic, and also internal traffic of peoples in this continent. Here we have yet other stories, and I would like to note that in the history of the Atlantic traffic of enslaved peoples, we may work using different premises, say, for example, resistance. There was, or there are other papers. I have chosen two authors here, two women. It was a coincidence, mind you, and in these two books, Mariana Candido, a Brazilian historian, she studies the Atlantic trafficking in specific locations in the Benguela region, for example, and more specifically, and she emphasizes the presence of women in this activity, women being enslaved and women in relation to that activity that is slavery. This is based on the diaspora. There are many historians in the Americas who, based on the diaspora, have written and focused on some specific cases. And this further enriches our ability to understand, precisely because all of these studies, these stories, with some minor breaks or interruptions, allow us to get to know many experiences related to this Atlantic trade of enslaved African citizens, both men and women. And all this contributes to looking into the various dimensions of trafficking. We have some examples here where there might be others. There are many other historians in the Americas that speak about this despicable traffic. And it's not just facts and figures. We have to think that the social history allows us to see or take these human lives beyond the numeric discussion of how many people were embarked alive and actually reached our shores alive, that were forcibly brought from the American continent. I mean, from Africa to the American continent. Going back to the opening topic of my presentation, we cannot talk about this without remembering that this is the story of present past, and this is a concept that has been especially developed by 3 historians, female historians from Brazil, who coined this term past present, or present past, better said, to refer to long dating histories based on something that happened in the past, but which is an inheritance which lived throughout time. Why is this alive, as the prior speaker said? That's because the effects of Atlantic trafficking of these African slaves has long-lasting effects. And there are some other aspects during the colonial period. And we must also think of the African diaspora in the Americas. We have yet other effects which are directly linked to the history of this despicable trade. So when we talk about this, that is the Atlantic trafficking of enslaved peoples, if we speak of it from the human rights standpoint, we are engaging in a current debate about responsibilities and redress. Today in Brazil, there is an important debate going on with the support of the Federal Public Ministry. There are prosecutors and judges and justices involved, and there is a heated debate in relation to large financial companies that have a track record or history of having been involved in illegal trade, illegal human trafficking in Brazil, and which appear to have participated in the history of slavery. There are organizations, companies that are demanded to speak about their historical responsibility in this process. So today there are certain things that have been put on the table for discussion, which have to do with this debate. There were many companies that were involved in this trafficking. We therefore have the human right to history, to memory. We have to be familiar with the roots, the paths of this Atlantic trafficking of enslaved peoples here in the Americas. We are enlightening or shedding light on these stories, and we are conquering the right to get to know and learn about these spaces where enslaved peoples, our ancestors, places where these people were present, places that were marked by their spirituality, their bodies, and evidently we are also talking about past and present time. This is an intellectual, academic discussion of the struggle and the fight for their rights, but also it is a political discussion because we are talking about rights. It is a struggle for rights, for human rights. Bringing this story of trafficking and bringing it into the limelight involves positioning ourselves as anti-racists, and we want to share this story as one way of perceiving injustice and people's ability to live, to react, to affirm themselves. And because of all of these reasons, we want to reivindicate policies and policies that see to and respond to African descendants and enslaved Africans and to the rest of them. And we want to get to know those parties that were subject to this violence and who lost their rights. There were significant impacts being borne by the history of slavery in the Americas. Thank you for the time allowed. I think I did not use up all of my time, but better then because we will have additional time for the Q&A. I'm very happy to be here sharing this moment, and I will now tell you about what activities and agencies I'm involved in. I'm part of the Brazilian Association for African Studies, the National Archive, the African Studies Laboratory reporting to the Federal Rio de Janeiro University. Thanks very much. Thanks, Monica, for your presentation and such an interesting approach. Now we will give the floor to Marisa Pinot, co-coordinator of this course, who is a graduate from the History course of University of Valencia and the Masters in African Studies for the Mexico College. You can read her bio on the platform. Marisa, if you want to start your presentation, and after completing it, we will bring you the questions from the audience. Okay, when you allow the video, please. Yes. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening again to those who are participating. I'm very happy for all the colleagues who preceded me, who have set a very high standard and who leave me in a very interesting position and also pose a challenge. My prior speakers spoke in global terms, which is good to understand this topic of slavery and the history of slavery in Africa and the Americas. A global history which is not referring just to the past, but to the present, which sensitizes us, which touches our hearts. Now I will talk about the case of Argentina, specifically my country of origin, where there are significant discussions related to the role of slavery in Argentinian history and in the present time. Generally, as mentioned by some of the people or the colleagues who took the floor before me, in school textbooks, reference is often made to slavery as something of the past, something that was left behind. It was part of colonial times. even it is sometimes presented in the case of Argentina, I'm speaking, as something unique, but which was lost in time, as if the African descendants had disappeared, had made invisible in the 21st century. And not only that, which is also, and of course, a lie, and we'll tell you why in a minute, but also it is not only that, I mean, that slavery, which was suffered and sustained in the territory of Argentina today, it was a kind, benevolent slavery where actually the harsh, violent slavery were not present. I mean, this happened in those countries or regions where there were tobacco, sugarcane plantations, namely in southern United States, the Caribbean, and Brazil. Whereas on our territory, it was a kinder kind of slavery. Let me tell you, as my colleagues say, and as noted by many studies on the matter, especially those conducted in the 21st century, that slavery during the colonial times in Argentina was a foundational element of that story, and also that it was not kind or benevolent. Rather, and much on the contrary, it was a history of violence, of deprivation of rights. There was intrinsic violence in that relationship, and many of these situations that were presented as social, economic, and cultural relations are still present today. Why do I say this? Because if we take into account that slavery during the colonial period, starting with 1500, for the port of Buenos Aires, and following the second foundation of Buenos Aires until the year 1640, the inflow of slaves was the main activity in these ports. These enslaved peoples that were brought via the Buenos Aires port did not stay in Buenos Aires. Oftentimes, they were traded and taken to the rest of the subcontinent. This was mentioned before, and I would like to emphasize it. These people were carried, I mean, there was some kind of interim transit. There was, on the one hand, the Atlantic transport that has been mentioned already, but then there was yet another period of suffering when they were forcibly transferred from the Buenos Aires port to other regions, to the mainland, and especially to Potosí, which, as you know, was back then, back in the 16th and 17th centuries, even the start of the 18th century, Potosí was one of the most important cities in the world. They exploited the silver mines, silver that fed the Chinese, Asian, and European economies. So the Potosí economy should be operational, and that's where slaves were taken. At least many of the slaves were taken there. Also, Chile was another destination, Alto Peru, of course, Potosí, and even far more remote locations in the American continent that was under the Spanish domain. This population was used as enslaved labor in the mining business, but also in rural activities for manufacturing, which is very interesting to note. For example, in the case of the province of Cordoba in Argentina, where there was a circuit of Jesuit missions, they had a strong presence that were very active until 1776, when they were expelled from the country. And those workers, those African and African descendant slaves who were there, engaged in producing bells, for example, bricks, there was an activity, not only rural, but also they engaged in agriculture and cattle raising, and also in manufacturing. And of course, there was a very important task which they developed working in households, both for European and Creole families. So there is a very strong presence of that African population in the territory. This is a territory which, as mentioned earlier, where, I mean, in the Americas in general, women, European women, were a minority, less than 20%, more than 80% of women living on the territory that comprises Argentina today, and more generally speaking, the territory under the Spanish Crown dominion, they were African women. So we may not lie, we may not just ignore this presence, but how many people are we talking about? The most recent papers, and I'm sure that those that will be done in future will give us even more important figures, show that as part of that complex formed by El Colonial Sacramento, Montevideo, and Buenos Aires during the colonial period that is between the 17th century and 1810, the first independent government in Argentina, there were at least 200 people, enslaved peoples. This is a very high figure, truly high to take into account. And why do I speak of Montevideo, Colonial Sacramento, and Buenos Aires? Because we may not think of just one of these cities in isolation. We have to think of the Rio de la Plata as a whole. The Buenos Aires port was a poor one in terms, or because it was a shallow water port, ships and vessels would get stranded, whereas the port of Montevideo is wonderful for mooring. On the other hand, Colonia del Sacramento, which at the time was controlled by the Portuguese kingdom and then was taken over by by Uruguay because of diplomatic arrangements. Well, it was then taken over by Spain. So those three ports, or between or among these three ports, they make up this amount, and we have to take this into account as a whole. This population we are talking about, that is 200,000 people, at least 200,000 people, they came via Brazil. And this has, I mean, especially from Rio de Janeiro, then they went down the Brazilian coastline and what was known as the Banda Oriental at the time, now Uruguay. This relates to maritime routes, the oceanic transport that facilitated transit between Africa and South America. But we need to take into account that from Buenos Aires and Montevideo, there were maritime transfers or vessels that went to Africa to capture slaves. And this is something that has come up in new historical research, and there will surely be more news and more interesting data to share in some periods to come.
Well, in order to have an idea how many people we are talking about first, let's think that it has been a census at the colonial times that dates back to 1776 that showed that half of the population in Buenos Aires and of the Buenos Aires area were African or from African descent. Then there was a strong presence of African descendants from in those times. There was a presence of Afro-mestizos, and we need to understand that most of them were Africans or Afro-descendants. Most of them were freed slaves. But when they arrived, they came as slaves. By 1778, the Santiago del Estero's census in one of the provinces that it is an area where there is a strong indigenous presence. Half of the population at that time was African or African descent. And in the city of Cordoba, by 1778, the census stated that 50% of the populations were mestizos and 15% people that were born or came from Africa. It means that at that time, there was a time in which the Rio de la Plata Viceroy was created and that Buenos Aires became very important in the Atlantic concept. We have to think of the rural sectors, of the rural areas, of areas that were not white. I mean, those were African descendants, mestizos, and most of European populations were clearly a minority. But there has been an increase in the African population that were forced into our territory and that were sold or were distributed while they were suffering hunger and a very, very poor health condition after the voyage, and they were distributed in the viceroyship, the Rio de la Plata viceroyship, that goes from 1776 to 1810. In those 30 and something years, many people were forced into this territory from the three ports, Buenos Aires, Colonia, Montevideo. They amounted to 72,000 persons. Why am I interested in pointing this out? Because what we see that the population of Africans and Afro-descendants, but population that were originated in Africa, they were born in Africa and they were forced into our territories. They were the ones participating in the wars of independence. Then we have to think of the independence of the Rio de la Plata, an independence in which the Africans played a vital role. And in fact, they gave their lives for their independence. And this explains that long and winding road towards abolishment of slavery that affected Argentina or that Argentina went through. Because in order to talk about this topic in which we claim that there has been a pleasant slavery or canned slavery in our territories, and it is said that slavery was abolished or finished in the early stages, unlike other territories, because during the first colonial governments or in 1812, the trafficking was prohibited. That is true, trafficking was prohibited. And the assembly of the year 13th, that was the first political organization that lasted longer and that took many measures that would become part of the legal corpus of Argentina. This assembly decided that as of January 31st, 1830, all the persons that were born that as from that time would become free persons. That however, freedom was not complete from that time, but since 1813 and up until the enactment of the Constitution 40 years later, those that lived in those years were subject to a legal status that considered them free men or libertos. That people were still subject to safeguard or protection status. They did not have freedom of movement. They had to work for their old owners that were still their owners. And they could access those that were born before January 31st, 1813 could access that condition of freedman by deciding to become part of the armies, the libertarian armies. These libertarians or independence armies, like the ones led by General Belgrano, General San Martin, were extremely important, and I will reiterate this later, were very important for the construction of the development of the Argentine independence, as our national constitution was enacted in 1853 and adopted by the province of Buenos Aires in 1860. I'm interested in pointing out that in Argentina there has been no law for the abolishment of slavery, but rather the end or abolishment of slavery has become is a constitutional mandate. Article 15 of the National Constitution, that has been maintained even after the reforms of the Constitution, states, in Argentina there are no slaves. The very few that still remain today have been freed from this moment on. Every contract for the acquisition of persons is a crime, and the slaves that for any reason enter and our territory become free when stepping on the Argentine soil. It's very important to point this out because in many countries there is a law for the abolishment of slavery. However, in our country is done by a constitutional mandate, and this constitutional mandate set forth in Article 15 is the one that continues Article 14. Article 14 guarantees all civil freedom of all the dwellers of the Argentine land or soil, freedom of expression, freedom of movement, and so on and so forth. It's a restatement or reaffirmation of Article 14. And I also wonder why it was not used as predicate. I mean, the first article to speak or to make this categorical assertion against slavery. Well, in order to conclude, I would like to point out some of these ideas and then to leave enough time for discussion or questions and answers. First, I would like to point out the key role that was later on denied of slavery in the Argentine history. Why? Because that kind of social relationship that was economic and social relationships that were established during colonial times, through which many companies and many families benefited from that despicable trafficking, as was just mentioned, that it's an integral part of the formation of this country, despite the image that is still transmitted that our country is a white country. Secondly, I would like to point out that slavery that occurred in colonial times and even up to the beginning of the era of independence was not kind, was not pleasant, that slavery was not featured by good manners or kindness, but rather it was slavery based on violence and any situation of slavery. And I believe that is why it has become invisible in history and it is not remembered. Third point, the Afro-descendants and African population played a very important role in the wars of independence. And I want to give you an example, the example of a person that is María Remedios del Valle. She was born in 1776 or 1777 and died in 1847. She was the captain of the army of General Belgrano. She participated as a member of the struggles or fights of the English invasions of 1807 and 1806 and 1807, as is mentioned in the records. Then she enlisted together with her children and husband in the army of the north of General Belgrano. She participated in the battles. There are documents attesting of the respect that Belgrano had to her because of her courage and daring. She was an Afro-descendant. She had resided in the city of Buenos Aires. She was born in the city of Buenos Aires, and she was recognized for her successive subsequent claims. And she was recognized as a participant in the Wars of Independence. She was given a pension because given the recognition granted by Viamonte. And there were several situations in which we learn more about her given the documents available. Therefore, in April 2013, Law 26,852 was enacted, setting November the 8th, that was the date of her death, in memory of Maria Remedio del Valle as the mother of our homeland. Therefore, November the 8th was set as a national day of the Afro-Argentines and the Afro culture. This implies a recognition of her engagement in the involvement of the African population in our country. It's a way in which we move away from this invisibility nature, and it shows, as we saw in the demonstrations made by the Afro movements in our country, that there's still a long way to go. As Professor Lima, that spoke before me, said, this is a present history, it's a political history, and is a history for the struggle against racism and for rights. And this international cause goes along that way in order to raise our awareness and to help us continue with these discussions. Thank you so much. Thank you, Marisa, for your words. Now we will open the Q&A session. There have been some questions raised by the audience. We will start with this question for Monica Lima de Souza. Whether you know and you can give examples of the way in which awareness is raised and reparation is given to enslaved individuals or persons. I will try to give you some examples, but there are many examples. Well, there are many examples, and we have seen throughout the history of slavery in Brazil, there have been several stages in which the enslaved populations or the freed men claimed their rights. There is a major example of the 18th century when an enslaved woman in the northeast of Brazil, in one of the provinces, wrote a letter to the governor complaining about the ill treatment she had suffered. She had been separated from her husband, and today that woman is recognized as the first lawyer, the first Black lawyer in the history of our country. And there are many different histories like hers that have marked our process. In the 19th century, there have been freed men and women that have been that used the newspapers, the media. They sent correspondence to the authorities to claim for their rights. But I mean, what is happening today? Because I have been moving along a timeline. Today, there is a reparation action meant by the law, a law that has included the teaching of the history of the Black people in Brazil. And this content should be a part of all the curriculum, not only in history, in science, in art, in every subject and in every public and private school in our country. Basic education from kindergarten to high school. These topics should be part of the curriculum, and that law has made all those contents to be mandatory in the training of teachers training courses. It is a reparation law. Then this has been a successful action fostered by the Black Brazilian movement that is formed by scholars and professionals that have pursued this initiative. Thank you so much. Now there are two more questions. The first one is whether you know what, if you know what happened with slavery in Chile. And the second question is addressed to Marisa, and the question is, in the current census, do they consider the ethnic origin of the population in Argentina? I will talk about Argentina. I don't know whether Monica wants to talk about Chile. There's new research in Chile that shows how this research shows how pitiful this was, even more pitiful, because imagine the situation in which enslaved persons went through the Atlantic, got in through Buenos Aires, traveled the 800, 900 kilometers to Mendoza by land, and then they had to cross the Andes. Or else, they could, the trafficking went along the Magellan Strait, reaching the south of the continent and then up to Chile. There are several research groups in Chile that are showing how the enslaved population participated in vineyards. They worked for vineyards with the development of vineyards. And then in the next few years, we hope we can have positive results in this regard. Secondly, as regards the census, I've talked about the oldest census because the ones that were conducted during the independence stage of Argentina did not ask any question about ethnicity. And this was related with the idea of forming an Argentine citizenry that was consistent, that did not imply any ethnic difference. At least it was not recognized by the state, though it was recognized socially. We need to talk about the colonial census and the ones that made a distinction as to ethnicity was the person in charge of doing the census. Then this has to do with the class they belong to. What this means is that there were not so many white persons. As regards the contemporary Argentina, we need to say that in the last two censuses, the one in 2010 and the one that was conducted in 2022, there is a question about ethnicity. And there is a very important difference here because the Afro movement in Argentina, as from the summit against discrimination and racism that was done in Durban in 1999, convened by the UN, the Afro movement decided to take the Afro-descendant denomination. They stopped talking about mestizos or black. They recognize themselves as Afro-descendants. That is a legal status or legal and social category. That's the way they have denominated themselves. And during the first years of the 21st century, they have claimed and even there were two pilot censuses that took place in the city of Santa Fe and in the city of Buenos Aires. They claimed to include this ethnic origin in the platform or in the structure. This was included in 2010, but not in general terms in all the census structures, but only in some specific areas or cities in the country, cities that had less than 50,000 inhabitants. And in 2022, this question was included as a general question, but it was not up to the person that conducted the census, but it was a question for the individual. The person that was being censed was asked whether he knew whether he had African origins or whether he was or she was considered African descendants. We still don't have the data from 2022, but in 2010, there was a law campaign to raise the awareness, and the census had many problems. However, there were 150,000 persons that recognized themselves as Africans or Afro-descendants.
In any case, the estimates indicate that at least 2% of the population represents them, and this has to do with the African mestizo population. Thanks very much, Marisa. One last question, also for you, related to whether there is any plan in the Argentinian education system that puts these facts into the limelight and which ensures these are included in the teaching syllabuses. There are many new books that are being published, and I must say that since Law 26852 provides that this is a national day, it should be therefore acknowledged and recognized at all education levels, especially in elementary and high schools. There's no such law as the one Monica mentioned in our country, but we must say that there is some interesting work which has been done in different situations and in different fields. Primary and secondary education is imparted at a federal level in Argentina, and also in the province of Santa Fe, Santiago del Estero, Córdoba, where there is a significant participation by the African movements that are insisting on and are ensuring that school curricula will include these topics to ensure they are made more visible and to do away with this lack of visibility that has prevailed for many years.